I'd like to ask you first of all to tell me something about your son, what kind of a kid he was.
Emmett was considered a leader among his friends. He was the kind who he was very conscious of older people. He was very responsible when it came to doing what he was supposed to do. And there were many people who, if there was a little activity plan, they would call me. Emmett usually went to Argo. That's where most of his friends were. And if there was something the boys had planned to do, some of the mothers would call me and find out if Emmett was going. And if he was going, then their sons could go.
And he was 14 years old.
He was 14. He was 14 the 25th of July, 1955.
And toward the end of that summer, he went down to visit family. Can you tell me about how that trip was organized and who went and how they got there?
Yes. Mose Wright, my mother's brother-in-law, was visiting his children in Chicago. At the last minute, we learned that he was going south and he was going to take a couple of his grandsons with him. And Emmett wanted to go along. Well, we had quite a bit of consultation on the matter, and we finally decided that we would let Emmett go. And the reason for this was we had two of Mose Wright's daughters here. One, Thelma, we took her when she was in 3rd grade. She was then in Chicago Teachers College. The other daughter, who was younger, we took her in 7th grade and kept her until she graduated high school. And on that basis, Emmett pointed out to us, if you can take 2 of their daughters and keep them as long as you have kept them, then why can't you let me go to Mississippi for a week or 10 days? And so we did.
Had he ever been to Mississippi before?
Only with my mother when he was a little baby.
And how did they get down to Mississippi?
Papa Mose took them, Uncle Mose took them on the train.
From the Illinois Central Station?
Yes, 12th Street Station is where my baby joined them, and they went together on the train. City of New Orleans.
Did you take him down to the station?
Oh, yes.
What do you recall about sending him off?
Oh, what a hassle we had trying to get him on the train, because we nearly missed the train. But once we got down, I couldn't even go up to the platform with him. They made me stay downstairs. And Emmett was able to catch the train. We waited just in case he was going to miss it. But when we had waited a reasonable length of time, we knew that Emmett was on the train, so I came back home.
How did you then get word that he was missing?
That Sunday morning, about a week later, I got a phone call from William A. Jones, Mose Wright's oldest daughter. Her son was in Mississippi. He was one of the children who went, one of the grandsons. He called his mother. She in turn called me. But a very strange thing happened. When I took Emmett to the train, and when he boarded the train, I came back home planning a very exciting weekend because I had a friend visiting me from St. Louis. But all of a sudden my legs went out. And for 1 week I was unable to walk. There was nothing hurting. My legs just didn't function for 1 entire week. Saturday before day Sunday morning, I made the decision to go to Mississippi and come back with Emmett. And the minute I made that decision, I jumped out of bed and my legs were working beautifully. And we've never understood what happened.
And then he was missing. You learned that was a Sunday night, and I guess it was Wednesday when his remains were found in the river.
Yes.
And how did you get word about that?
Well, again, the Associated Press, I believe, called my mother's home where I was. I went directly to my mother's house when this news broke. And I was monitoring the telephone at the time, and they called wanting to speak to someone, and I instinctively knew what they were going to say. But when I looked all around, I said, you know, I'm the only one here who can take the message you have for me. And finally, I got the message.
There was an incredible reaction to what happened. I recall looking at pictures that I've seen that were published in the Defender. His remains were sent back up to Chicago, and they arrived at Illinois Central Station, the same station from which he had left maybe 10 days before. And there were pictures of you there. Do you recall being down at the station when his remains came back up here?
Oh, yes, yes.
Tell me what you remember about that.
I remember when they began to unload the body, I looked and I saw the biggest box I'd ever seen in my life. The box just seemed to be almost the size of a house. And I realized that that box had my baby's body in it. And I was just overwhelmed with grief.
The body, I believe, was handled by Sammy Rayner.
A. Rayner, yes.
And there was a long wake over at the Robert's Temple,
yes,
where tens of thousands of people came by. Could you understand at the time why there was such an interest in this?
No, I didn't understand why there was such an interest, and also I didn't understand my decision that the world should see what I had seen. It was as if I was being dictated to. It was as if another power, the Almighty, was telling me what to do. In fact, I remember the day when the phone call came that Emmett's body had been discovered. The impact was such a shock until it seemed that I saw a dove go out of the left side of my head, and it just hovered above, almost out of eye view. And I was told that I will tell you what to do. And I listened to that voice. Every decision I made came through that dove, which, being Church of God in Christ, I interpreted as being the Holy Spirit. And everything we did was not of me. I didn't feel that I was capable of making those decisions or doing some of the things I did. But knowing the Lord and praying the way we had been praying, every turn we made was one that was profitable. And we know that it was of the Lord.
It was not something you could have done by yourself?
No. No.
What do you recall of the crowds inside the church during the wake?
I remember the emotion. As people would file by the casket, almost 1 in every 5 would faint. And this included men, women, and children. And the screams, the screams were just incredible. It was almost as if people were looking at their own child there rather than a stranger they didn't know. It was at that time that I knew Emmett was not just mine, he was a universal child.
You spoke up very courageously at that time. I recall in the film that we just saw where you said that if the death of your son could start a movement to cause this country to clean up its own backyard, then his death wouldn't have been in vain.
Mm-hmm.
What was able to possess you to speak like that at that time with that degree of composure?
Again, I say, Rich, it was the Holy Spirit. It was the power from God Himself. Because at that time, I feel that I was almost a very immature young woman. I'd never had to rely on myself to make big decisions because Mama was there. And all of a sudden, I looked around and I saw that Mama wasn't able to help me. In fact, I was trying to comfort her. And I had to turn to the Lord. I still know, I don't feel, but I know that Emmett's death was not just one of those things. His death had a divine purpose. And I think we see it reflected in the lifestyle that many of us are able to enjoy today. The freedom, the political freedom, and even the social freedoms. I feel that Emmett's death really paved the way for us to enjoy a type of life that we had not been able to enjoy before.
How do you think it influenced the movement that was already in progress, but perhaps this gave some more speed to? How do you think it affected it?
It certainly gave speed to it. I feel it was like gasoline that was being thrown on an already raging fire. It seemed that people found courage that they didn't know they had. People were willing to stand up. They were willing to face death. They were willing to do whatever it took to change the conditions.
There were some other very courageous people, I think especially of Mose Wright, who
Oh, yes.
he stood up in open court, a black man, and pointed a finger at two white men and said they were guilty. That simply wasn't done in Mississippi. How do you suppose he was able to do that?
Well, you know, Mose Wright was a preacher. He too, a Church of God in Christ minister, had his own church. And I too feel that the power that he received came directly from the Lord. Because it was unprecedented that a black man would even testify, and to point a finger and testify, that was just, that was out of the ordinary.
Also at the trial, Congressman Charles Diggs was there. What do you recall of his presence?
Oh, what a wonderful feeling it was when I knew that a congressman had come all the way from Detroit, Michigan, to join me in that dark hour. I felt of him as a pillar of strength. I felt protected because he was there, and it was just wonderful to know that someone of his status would take time to come down to Mississippi to see about me. I felt that he came personally to see about me.
What do you recall of the way in which he was received, or first of all, not only by the whites down there, but by the blacks, who I presume had never seen a black member of Congress, much less a black office holder of any kind?
Well, you can imagine what would happen if the President of the United States were to walk in the room right now. Everyone was in awe. They looked at him as if he was something almost from outer space. I don't really, I think the whites were quite resentful. I mean, they thought he had no business being there. I mean, they were going to handle that situation. But for the blacks, they felt as I did. Here is someone who is a tower of strength, and he's coming down to rescue us.
Really, the attention of the world was on that trial for several days. And you went down there to testify yourself. How were you received by the law enforcement officials of Tallahatchie County?
I had very little direct contact with them. When I arrived at the courtroom, I was hustled into a waiting room. I didn't even know the people. I guess there were deputies who took charge of me. I talked to the prosecuting attorney, and that was about the extent of my contact with the people around. So I don't really know how the lawyers and the other court principals received me. But I do know this. I know the reaction of the people as I would approach the courtroom every day. There were jeers. There were children pointing little toy guns at me, and they would pretend to pull the trigger, and they would go bang, bang. And their parents and the other whites, mostly men, oh, they just thought it was a hilarious thing. They would just slap their legs and they would just laugh at the antics of the children. The black people made a corridor with their bodies. I walked every day to the courtroom with blacks lined on both sides of the sidewalk as if to protect me as I approached the courtroom.
Do you recall Sheriff Strider?
Only vaguely.
There's one rather famous photograph, and it shows him handing you a subpoena to testify. Do you remember when he handed you the subpoena?
Not really, no.
You saw that little speech he gave in the film.
Yes. Oh, yes.
What is your reaction to hearing something like that in 1985, looking back at 1955?
Well, I don't believe we would hear that in 1985. Thanks to what happened in 1955, we don't have to go that route anymore.
The sheriff's riders are a thing of the past.
Those sheriff striders, they are a thing of the past, yes.
What do you think now when you see those pictures of the defendants, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, sitting in the courtroom?
Well, it certainly brings back to my mind their relaxed attitude, the holiday festivities that went on in the courtroom, because it was just as if we were at a Ringling Brothers circus. I mean, it was yay, hey, hey, and the beer and the laughter.
In the courtroom?
In the courtroom, yes. And the babies, the antics of the children, they were holding their children, and as they would say cute things or whatever they would do, their attention would be focused on the babies, and there was a lot of laughter. And but so far as feeling towards Milam and Bryant is concerned, I can truthfully say that I have not wasted any of my energies or wasted any of my time hating them, blaming them, or wanting to get even with them. It was almost as if they were wiped out of my consciousness.
What was your concern at the time?
What was my concern in the courtroom? More or less a matter of getting in and out alive every day. It was quite heated in that courtroom. The tension, you could feel the tension every day. When the jury retired to bring in the verdict, I spoke to my party and I said, let's make our departure. They said, oh, we want to wait and see what the verdict is. I said, oh no. I said, the verdict is not guilty. And the farther we are away from here, the better off we are going to be, because, well, at that time I wasn't so much aware of what happens when a baseball team wins a pennant or wins the World Series, but I knew it was going to be something on that order, and it was. Even on the radio, going back to Dr. T.R.M. Howard's house that evening, the screams and the revelry, the excitement of the non-guilty verdict just came right through the radio. And we were glad that we were miles away from that courthouse.
You were in Mumbai, I guess, when you that evening.
We had just about made our arrival back to Mumbai. And then after the trial was over, and we tried to get passage back to the Memphis airport, we were too hot to handle. Nobody would give us refuge. No one would even take us in their car to get us back to the airport. And finally, we were able to get a cab. But the cab driver didn't recognize us. And when he did recognize who we were, he turned the lights out on his cab, and it was night. It was very, very dark. There were no street lights any place because we were out in the country. And he put the accelerator to the floor. He got us to the airport as fast as he could, and he didn't even want to take our money. I mean, so if he had to give us change, he didn't have time to do it. He just wanted to get us out of his cab. So we gave him, I don't know what we gave him, but we told him to keep the change. And you could hear the tires squealing as he tried to make a U-turn to get back to Memphis, I guess it was.
Did you think it was a fair trial from what you saw of the prosecution?
No. In the course of the trial, they even tried to make me admit that I was a co-conspirator in the death of my son for the sake of a little 5-cent and 10-cent policy which doubled in benefits. So there was no such thing as fairness in the trial.
An all-white jury?
All-white jury, yes.
How about the judge, Judge Swanger? Did he seem to be fair to you?
I didn't have too much contact with Judge Swanger. The only time I saw him was when I was in the witness chair. And at that time, my mind was focused on saying yes, sir, and no, sir, because I had been well trained to make sure you don't say yes and no. And of course, he was just a shadowy figure sitting to my left or to my right, and I didn't have any direct contact with him.
I want to check to see how our tape is doing. Are we about to run out on that?
Yes. Okay.
There are some other rather courageous people at that trial, or Medgar Evers was played a role in there. Do you recall what he did as far as he was one of the people, I guess, who dug up some of the hidden witnesses, or the unknown witnesses, the secret witnesses at
Yes.
that time.
Mm-hmm.
What do you recall about your contacts with him at the time?
I only saw him briefly. I did get a chance to sit in the courtroom at the little wooden table for a few moments. And I remember on one of those days he was present. And of course he talked to me. And he told me that he was with me, that they were with me, meaning the NAACP. And any way they could help, that they would do so. I didn't really have a full knowledge of what his role was. I knew that he had something to do with the witnesses, but I didn't really know the extent to which his work went.
Also, Willie Reed was one of the people who testified for the prosecution. That,
Yes.
again, was an act of courage, was it not?
Yes, yes, because he was just a boy. Now, Willie came here. I met Willie. Willie stayed in my home. He eventually went to work for Jackson Park Hospital. And we tried to keep in touch with Willie, but as years went by, I know he married, he had a family, and then he just sort of disappeared. I don't know where Willie went.
And Amanda Bradley was another person.
Yes.
What did Willie and Mrs. Bradley, what were they able to testify? What was it that they had seen or heard that made them relevant to the trial?
They were close enough to the barn where my son was taken until they could hear the lashes, they could hear the screaming, and Willie even dared to creep over to the barn and peek in, and he could identify the people who were in the barn with my son.
Were you surprised by the verdict?
Oh, no. I was surprised when they couldn't get a guilty verdict on the kidnapping, the removing from the home. But I knew what the verdict was going to be so far as the murder was concerned. This is why I chose for us to leave the courtroom before the decision came in.
Within 48 hours after the verdict came down, the verdict came out on Friday. That Sunday, you were in Harlem in New York City. There was a crowd of 10,000 to whom you spoke.
I think 100,000 would just about do it justice.
Well, the film shows you there with A. Philip Randolph. What was going on in your mind at that time, and why did you want to do what you did and to speak out to those people?
Rich, it was necessary that we talk. There is no way we could have remained silent after what had happened to Emmett. And in talking, we were getting relief. And not only were we getting relief, we were calling attention to something that needed to be done. There was a job that needed to be done. It wasn't right for part of the people in the United States of America to have nothing, not even freedom of speech. And you know, living in a small town like Argo, Illinois, and most of us live in small neighborhoods and whatnot, and we don't really know what's going on outside our little neighborhoods. But I had a chance to see that there was something very, very wrong with the way we had to live and the things that others were able to enjoy. And I needed to speak out against that. I needed to call attention that we're all Americans and we all are entitled to the same things.
It was just a year after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that called for the desegregation of the nation's schools.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few months after Justice Warren's ruling that that desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed, and this was just a couple of months before the Montgomery bus boycott that was led by or touched off by Rosa Parks.
Mm-hmm.
Your son's death really did turn out to be a key event in the reaction to it, didn't it?
We certainly think it did. Yes. We feel that Rosa got her courage from what happened to Emmett. We feel that Dr. King picked up the torch because of what happened to Emmett. Because when the world looked in and saw what happened to a little 14-year-old boy, it was just more than they could swallow. It was just more than they could take and say, well, that's one of those things. Everybody felt they needed to do something.
Of the two men who were charged with the killing of your son, one of them has died. The other is still alive. And it's very likely that I will be seeing him shortly. What does a mother say to the murderer of her child after 30 years?
I don't know what I would say to him. I would like to hear him really talk to me. I would like to know what life has been like for him. I don't feel that I have wallowed in the grief of my son's death. I feel that I have moved on from there and I've gone on to do things that were profitable, I've reached out and I've helped other people. But I just wonder how Mr. Bryant's life has been. I almost feel sorry for him because I don't feel that he's been able to pick up the threads of his life and weave them into something that he would be proud of or that he could be happy about.
Can you, as a human being, forgive him for what he did 30 years ago?
Oh, yes. That was done within days after the death of my son. There's no way I could have carried that in my heart and been the kind of woman I feel that I am today. I just had no room for the hate. The hate is more or less like a cancer. I feel it would have just torn me apart. It would have been worse for me than it would have been for him. My hating would not hurt him. It wouldn't do anything constructive. Because of my faith in the Lord, I was able to put that aside and move on.
In talking to Simeon Booker, he said a number of things, and I just want to read a couple of these back to you. And he says, regarding you and being a part of the movement, he says, she did start a movement, but I think she never got credit. I never thought the people of Chicago got credit for their role in it, for the thousands of people who lined up to see that body and made that boy a hero. But yet now, 30 years later, I wonder to myself, do people really understand who Emmett Till is and was? I just wonder whether he has died in vain. Did your son die in vain?
No. I have 19 Emmett Till players right now who will testify that Emmett did not die in vain. But not only that, since 1973, I have been working with boys and girls, acquainting them with the words of Dr. King and their relationship to standing up, being counted. And those hundreds of boys and girls, I touched them because Emmett was taken away from me. Had I kept Emmett, I'm sure that I would have been involved with him, with my grandchildren. I might have never found the need to reach out and touch someone else. So because of Emmett's death, I was able to, I went back to school, as you probably know. I became a teacher. And I know that I have touched literally thousands of boys and girls. So for that reason, if no other reason, Emmett's death was not in vain.
Do you see a bit of your son in those kids that you deal with?
Oh, Lord, yes. I've felt that each and every one who has sat before me, they became mine. In fact, in my grief, I asked the Lord why my son was taken. And this is an encounter that I'll never forget. When the Spirit of the Lord entered that room, filled it to capacity, and I spoke to that presence as I'm speaking to you. Although we were not using words, I can't describe. It was a booming something, but I could actually talk. And the Lord told me that, number one, Emmett was not mine in the first place. That I had been chosen for him to spend the few years on earth in my care, and that Emmett actually belonged to God himself. He had a special mission on earth, but inasmuch as God took him away, he would give me thousands, and I have seen those thousands.
In LaFleur County, where Emmett was at the time he was abducted, it's been a long struggle for some pretty basic rights. But next week, when the election's down there, they're going to be electing within the city of Greenwood the first black alderman ever. And some people down there who recall the incidents of your son's death very well are going to be among the elected. Isn't it remarkable? Is it remarkable that it has taken this long, or is this some kind of a fulfillment of something that we're seeing down there now?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's remarkable that it has taken this long. We know that things don't happen overnight. But I certainly do feel that it is a fulfillment. It is something that is able to happen because of Emmett giving his life.
One other thing, at the time he died, there was this horrible picture that was published of him. Do you recall the picture that they published in Jet magazine?
Oh, yes.
It's not like the pictures you have on your mantelpiece. It's not like the pictures anybody has on its mantelpiece, but it had an effect on a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
When you look back now at that picture, what do you see?
I see that this had to be done. It was a first, the news media did not publish pictures of that nature because it was just something too horrible for the public to see. But if the world had not seen what had happened, the world needed this shock. They needed it. And when these pictures of Emmett hit the newsstands and people were really able to see what had happened to a youngster simply because of hate and race discrimination, I think it really let us see the ugly monster that race hatred is. It's almost as if it was embodied in his appearance, in his physical appearance, because it is a monster.
What is the meaning of your son in 1985? Why should people recall who he was and what he did and what happened to him? What's the lesson to be learned now?
Well, one thing we